Dearest Booktube, you are cordially invited to join me for tea to celebrate the end of the delightful month of Victober. There's a problem with this, you say. How can I take tea with you? Like the March Hare said to Alice, I will say, take some more tea. Booktube, take some more tea. Like Alice, you will reply, offended, I've had nothing yet, so I can't take more. And like the Mad Hatter, I will reassure you. You mean you can't take less, Booktube, because it's very easy to take more than nothing. And so, in 1865, Lewis Carroll in Alice in Wonderland has safely solved my virtual tea party problem. You are having more than nothing of tea with me, okay? Why am I talking about tea for the end of Victober? I think you can probably guess. Tea is everywhere in Victorian literature. Last week I was talking about chutney and how if you look hard you spot, the influence of India and the British Empire in India in Victorian books. But tea, you don't have to look hard. It is all over the place. I did a little experiment on my Kindle and I did a search in the ebook of Bleak House to see how many times the word tea comes up. 56 times. 56 times. Yeah, so everywhere. Right at the end of the Victorian era, you get the funniest play in Victorian literature, and I think possibly the funniest play in all of English literature ever, even funnier than Shakespeare's comedies, okay? The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. If you haven't read it, you must, or watch a good adaptation. All the most important scenes in that book seem to take place involving tea and muffins, or tea and cucumber sandwiches. Gwendolen and Cicely can barely bear to speak to each other after they find out that they're both supposedly engaged to Ernest, and yet they sit and have a cup of tea together. Now, if you're a Jane Austen July aficionado as well as a Victober watcher and participator, you'll have noticed tea coming up in Jane Austen too, yeah? So she was writing at the very, very beginning of the 19th century, or end of the 18th, very beginning of the 19th by the time it was published. And the tea drinking, and I must actually pour myself out some, or I'll get very dry, very dry. The tea drinking that you see in Jane Austen is a kind of upper class or middle class occupation. Yes, it's a sort of genteel drink. By the time you get to Dickens or Eliot or Elizabeth Gaskell, say, you'll see tea being drunk right across the social spectrum in the book. So in Bleak House, Lord and Lady Dedlock will take tea, but so will the brickmakers, who are like the poorest of the poor, apart from Joe the crossing sweeper in the book. Lady Dedlock may have her elegant china tea in a beautiful teacup, and the bricklayers, it's a mug of sweet tea and a bit of bread. But it's become the universal British drink by that stage. A really good illustration of this you get from another of the tropes of the Victorian novel, the workhouse. Yeah, you know the workhouse, the poorhouse, as in Oliver Twist. That's the classic example, but it comes up again and again, doesn't it? Now, and that was this strange institution that was somewhere between a prison, a forced labour camp, a hospital, an old people's home, an asylum, and an orphanage, where we kind of corralled our poor and controlled them. Now, in the 1830s, Brighton had built a new workhouse, and it built its new workhouse with a brew house for brewing beer, because most of what the inmates were given to drink was beer. People drank beer because it was safer than water. Yeah, the fermenting process actually sanitized it. But the women and the elderly infirm men got a pint of tea at breakfast. But Brighton's workhouse was considered generous in its catering at that time. Now, moved to the other end, 50 years later, 1881, a visitor to the Manchester workhouse reported being proudly shown the workhouse teapot, and that workhouse teapot was big enough to take 175 gallons of tea. 175 gallons. How much is that? That's unbelievable. So you can see it's gone from being, we'll let the elderly and infirm have a bit of tea in the 1830s through to everyone's having it. No more beer by then. We'll see the influence of that sort of rather moral Victorian temperance movement. Tea was seen as safer and more suitable. So, the history of British tea, is it all polite tea parties and temperance meetings and or even like honest brick makers? Well, actually they're not very honest, are they, in North and South, but you get the general idea. Enjoying a nice sweet cup of tea to get them through their painfully sad and tough existence. Well, it's not all that, if we're honest. The story of British tea drinking is tied up with trade and smuggling and empire and wars and slavery and industrial espionage, no less. So should we go on a little bit of a tour and investigate it? And we're going to start, somewhat surprisingly, with a currant bun. I made some currant buns yesterday, and I was going to bring one up and show you, and I've failed to bring it. I'll tell you what, I will put a photo of the currant bun in the thumbnail, which you will have already seen by the time you get to this bit, but you'll know why it was there then. Okay, so currant buns, tea cakes, hot cross buns, Bath buns, as enjoyed by Jane Austen, classic kind of British, and Western European sort of style of sweet, yeasty cake cum bread. Okay, now my currant buns that I made yesterday, they also had not just sweet yeasty dough and dried fruit in them, but also nutmeg, cloves, allspice, ginger and cinnamon. And the story of British tea drinking actually starts with spice. Why, you ask yourselves? Well, right back to medieval times, we enjoyed spicy food here in Western Europe, but it's not something that grows here, yeah? All those things, they all grow in the Far East. And to get them, we had to deal with sort of the Arab middlemen in the Middle East and the enterprising kind of trading minds of the far western edge of Europe started thinking to themselves, what if we could get direct to the east and cut out the middleman? Starts with the Portuguese and then the Dutch, and they do. Off they go. They get themselves eventually round Africa and to India and then on to what's now Indonesia, China and Japan. Now, they do find the spices that they wanted, but the other thing they find there is people drinking tea. Unknown previously, okay? So the first time that we hear about tea in Europe is in the 16th century. Time for a short slurp, as it's the first time we've come across tea. Those Portuguese and Dutch merchants had tried tea. Well, in China, they've been drinking tea for a couple of thousand years. They tried it there, they tried it in Japan. They got a bit of a taste for it. They thought, this is rather good. It was considered sort of medicinal and uplifting. Well, it is. It's a stimulant, but a mild and very enjoyable it is too. And they thought, well, I wonder if this is something that we can trade back in at home in Europe, as well as these spices, these high-value spices that we're bringing back. So they did. The first time that you hear of tea being brought to England is in 1657. And the kind of the legend is, and this may not be true, is that Charles II's Portuguese wife, Catherine of Braganza, popularised tea at the English court. So she married him in 1662, and yeah, apparently she brought fashionable tea drinking to the English upper classes. So so we're talking end of the 17th century. Into the 18th century, and the East India Company, who, now I mentioned them last week as well, they are, the epitome of global capitalism before it's known to be a thing, yeah. But they started to bring tea and trade tea and bring it back to England in sort of increasing quantities from China. And it had become fashionable enough that in 1706, Thomas Twining opened a tea house in the Strand in London, and for people to drink tea in the same way that there were, coffee houses where, tea and conversation, basically for men. But women wanted tea to drink at home. They weren't going to go to a tea house because that was a bit too louche, but they wanted to buy it. So in 1717, he opened an actual tea shop in the building next door, and women could then come and buy their little boxes of tea to take home and brew at home. Now, guess who bought her tea from Thomas Twining? Jane Austen again. Guess who's the other person buys her tea from Thomas Twining? Ros. Yes, Twining still make tea, and my favourite Earl Grey is made by Thomas Twining. So tea's becoming a fashionable London or upper class thing, yeah. By the mid 18th century, it's a middle class habit as well, and this is where we link into the slave trade, because adding sugar to tea's a bit bitter. Just adding sugar and milk to tea made it more palatable and less of a sort of an extreme upper class habit, and something that more people wanted to do. And of course, it was so sort of cheap sugar was then becoming available because of slave labour in the Caribbean and the Americas. So, but it was still quite expensive because of tax. It was a highly taxed product. Now, this brings us to our 18th century smugglers. Now, what's your image of an 18th century smuggler? Yeah, what are they smuggling? Is it barrels of brandy, probably? Is that what you're imagining? They did, but much, much more, what they were smuggling was tea. Yeah, because as people got the tea habit and they wanted to avoid the tax, something like 7 million tonnes of tea was smuggled into England in the 18th century. In the end, they decided to bring the tax down because it was pointless. Now, our friends, the East India Company, basically had a monopoly on the legal import of tea. My American friends will kind of a little light bulb will go off in your heads at this moment, because of course it was when the East India Company's monopoly was applied in the Americas as well that you get the Boston Tea Party and a key spark that incited the American Revolution. So yeah, tea's implicated all over the place basically. So so when they brought the tax down, yeah, and when was that? 1784. So that made tea gets more popular. So we're getting close to being in the 19th century. We're getting close to the Victorian era. Tea's becoming more popular. The East India Company made phenomenal profits on tea from China, and that profit from tea from China was what they used to fund their expansion in India, of course. But this gave Europe a bit of a problem. We had a balance of trade problem because we wanted Chinese tea and silk to some extent. They didn't really want anything that we produced. A bit of raw cotton from India, that was about it. So basically we were kind of hemorrhaging silver to China to pay for our developed tea habit, and silver started to run out. So we needed to find something else to sell the Chinese in exchange for tea. And what did the East India Company settle on? Opium. Yeah. So opium was a thing in China already, all right. But basically what they said to do was hugely expand the Chinese opium market. And why did they want to do that? Because where can you grow opium? In India. In fact, one of the key opium growing areas in India is Bengal, which was why in 1757 the East India Company, with their representative Robert Clive, fought a war against the Nawab of Bengal and took it over, basically to get control of the opium trade in order to be able to trade that with China for tea. Now, eventually, the Chinese emperor got a bit fed up with this. It's a complicated story, but more and more Chinese people were becoming addicted to opium. It had been a sort of like a niche habit, and it became so wide that it was really it was ruining China's economy and so on. And so, at a certain point, had enough, seized 20,000 chests of opium from the East India Company in Canton and chucked it in the river. What does this was in 1837. By now, Queen Victoria's on the throne. What does the young Victoria and her government do? They send the British Army to India to fight what was now known as the First Opium War, to basically force the Chinese to accept our opium so that we could have our tea. So there's a kind of a lovely irony that back in England, tea was sort of associated with gentility and respectability and so on. But meanwhile, we were pushing drugs, basically, in China in order to get it. Tea was very definitely associated with gentility, though. Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte, 1847. When Agnes Grey is trying to establish that before her family fell on hard times, before her father speculated away the family's sort of little bit of fortune, that they were respectable, kind of upper middle class types. Okay, and how does she kind of convey that? This is how she says. Okay. Our only intercourse with the world consisted in a stately tea party now and then with the principal farmers and tradespeople of the vicinity, just to avoid being stigmatised as too proud to consort with our neighbours. Yeah. So, something polite that you did in to sort of keep your position in society, and in fact to sort of almost like patronise the people who you saw as slightly below you. Let's have another example. Anthony Trollope, the warden. Okay, look at that picture there. It's your archetypal, like, English gentleman enjoying his morning tea to get his day off to a good start. Little tea parties, taking of tea, all the way through Trollope. Okay. Shall we have a more extreme example of how tea is seen to represent sort of respectability? Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Robert Louis Stevenson. Respectability, you say, but isn't that a book about the opposite, taking drugs and becoming a monster? Yes, it is, but final scene of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, not the final scene of the book, but the final scene of kind of the denouement, shall we say, of the story before we get the unpicking later. They break into Dr. Jekyll's house because they think that he's being assailed by Mr. Hyde, not knowing that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are two manifestations of the same person. They break down the door. They get in there. I'll give you a little bit. The besiegers, appalled by their own riot and the stillness that had succeeded, stood back a little and peered into the room. There lay the cabinet before their eyes in the quiet lamplight, a good fire glowing and chattering on the hearth. the cattle singing its thin strain, a drawer or two open, papers neatly set forth on the business table, and nearer the fire the things laid out for tea. The quietest room, you would have said, and but for the glazed presses full of chemicals, the most commonplace sight in London. But right there in the midst, there lay the body of a man, contorted and still twitching. That's the dying Mr. Hyde. So it's the juxtaposition that Stevenson does there between the tea things ready by the fire and Hyde convulsing on the floor to kind of draw out the shockingness of Mr. Hyde. Tea was also seen as a kind of like a positive for the working classes because of it not being intoxicating. An MP in 1846 said he was promoting again a reduction in tax on tea, and he said, well, it was a good idea because you'd be substituting the moral teapot in place of the demoralising ale jug. Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I'm enjoying my moral tea. Tea was also associated, if you look for it in Victorian novels particularly, with femininity. So North and South is another book that I really enjoyed this Victober, and Mr. Thornton in North and South, he first kind of like starts to fall for Margaret Hale when he watches her hands busy with the teacups. Yeah, it's a feminine thing. Esther Summerson in Bleak House, when she moves in with Mr. Jarndyce, you know that it's kind of a respectable thing and the status that he's giving her in his house, because you're told that she'd been installed into the responsibility of the teapot straight away. Well, you know, if you control the teapot, you know, you're a good woman. Mrs. Bagnet, my favourite couple in Bleak House, Mr. and Mrs. Bagnet. Mr. Bagnet, retired soldier, Mrs. Bagnet, you know, is a working class, but a good sort. And you know she's a good sort because when you meet her, she unpacks her shopping basket, and out of her shopping basket she takes a little tea and sugar, along with some mutton and bread. Yeah, sets the tone. Yeah. On the other hand, if you want to know what rotters the small weeds are in Bleak House, you have to listen to this scene. Okay, so the small weeds are like kind of money lenders. They're mean, cruel, heartless, you know, classic Dickens baddies. Yeah, and they have a poor, unfortunate charwoman. Charwoman's like the kind of lowest sort of servant, you know, poorly paid, does rough work. Okay, and they're responsible for providing her with a meal when she's there. Okay, now Judy is the small weed granddaughter. Okay, listen to this. Judy, not interested in what she has often heard, that's her grandfather going on about something, begins to collect in a basin various tributary streams of tea from the bottoms of cups and saucers and from the bottom of the teapot for the little charwoman's evening meal. In like manner she gets together in the iron bread basket as many outside fragments and worn-down heels of loaves as the rigid economy of the house has left in existence. That's what they feed their servant. The dregs of their teacups. Yeah. It's just one of those beautiful examples of how Dickens builds a character, isn't it? Or, you know, his characterisation, you know what the small weeds are like when you hear that they use the dregs from the saucers and the cups to make a basin of tea for poor old Charlie the charwoman. Meanwhile, let's go back to our friends in the East India Company. Now, we've just heard about the war that they had to fight, or the British government fought on their behalf, in fact, with China to make them take opium. essentially, I think anyone could see that the whole opium for tea, trade thing, it was potentially risky. Yeah, basically the fact that China had a monopoly on producing tea always put the East India Company at a bit potentially of a disadvantage. What's the answer? Well, of course they realised tea would grow in India. In Assam, tea was already growing, small quantities, not in the same way as in China, but it existed. It was obviously the right conditions. Now you see a little pattern here, because in 1826 they move in on Assam like they did in Bengal to be able to control the production of opium. They move in on Assam, take over Assam, and so they can start growing tea there. But they think they need Chinese plants and Chinese expertise to be able to really succeed with this, and I think they were probably right. So in 1848, this is the industrial espionage bit, they send a gardener come botanist called Robert Fortune off to China to go in disguise into the Chinese interior, because we were only allowed in the trading ports around the edges, in disguise to basically steal tea and expert workers to bring back to India, so that we could grow our own instead of having to buy it from the Chinese. How devious do you get? He was successful, yeah. The plants he brought back probably actually died out. They probably weren't successful. There was already tea, local tea plants that you could use, but the key thing was the expertise, knowing how best to grow it, cultivate it, pick it, process it, and that's what the East India Company got through their nefarious espionage in China in the shape of Robert Fortune. Now, growing tea is very labour intensive. How are they going to do it? Well, I think ideally they probably would have liked to use slaves, wouldn't they? That being the habit of the times. But in 1833, slavery had been abolished in the British Empire. So poor old East India Company, they've got to think again. So basically they come up with their own version. It's called indentured labour. So the local people that wanted work on the new tea plantations, technically they were free, but basically had to sign contracts. They'd sign away their lives for several years. They had to live on the tea plantation. They lived in tea plantation accommodation, everything. Their whole lives were controlled. They couldn't leave once they'd signed that contract, the indentured labour contract. Yeah, we used it all over the place subsequently, that kind of approach to what do we do when we can't have slaves anymore. Yeah, we'll just find a legal version. The slightly shocking thing that I should add at this point is that conditions on tea plantations in India, possibly today, certainly very recently, not that much better than they were for the indentured labourers of the 19th century. Companies like Twinings now have to you'll see, look, they do a little thing on their box about showing happy young girls who are getting an education thanks to Twinings' support on their tea plantations in Assam or wherever. It's a bit of a PR job, and I don't know if it's really perfect yet. But so now they're growing it in India, in Assam, but then they realise the Nilgiri hills in the south of India, they probably work for tea growing, and they did. Then what about the island of Ceylon, what we now call Sri Lanka? Let's grow tea there as well. Tea kind of takes off in India from the sort of middle of the 19th century onwards, and that means, of course, it's a much cheaper and more readily available product back in England. There's an interesting connection here with England's Industrial Revolution. Really, you say? tea and industrial revolution? Well, if people are drinking tea, what does it do? You're not drinking beer, so you're not attempting to operate heavy machinery, slightly intoxicated. But also, tea is a stimulant, and if it's taken with sugar and a bit of milk, basically it's a way to, like, how could you get your factory workers to work those appallingly long hours that we know they did? Well, they were sustained by sugary tea. Basically, that's what kept them going. Tea and bread, sugary tea and bread became like the subsistence diet, really, with maybe a little bit of meat once a week. That was the subsistence diet of the British factory worker. It also kind of allowed for urbanisation because, like, water supply were dangerous. We got cholera and so on. But tea is made with boiling water, so that allowed the population growth to sustain. Yeah, well, there you go. I could go on about all this stuff forever, and I shouldn't. But at the same time, it never stopped being an upper class and middle class drink as well. It was promoted in a quite a savvy way as a patriotic British drink, because now it was being grown in the British Empire in India. In 1851, British people were consuming 2 pounds of tea per year per head. Okay, that sounds like a lot to you. By 1901, when Queen Victoria died, do you know how much tea per head we were drinking per year? Over 6 pounds. Over 6 pounds of tea every, on average, every English person was drinking. So is it any wonder that your Victorian novels are full of tea parties and cups of tea? I hope you enjoyed taking tea with me, and I hope you've had a lovely Victober.